soon as you trust yourself, you will know how to live. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, German writer and statesman. I slept late the next morning, and when I awoke to bright sunshine, I darted from my bed. Why was it so quiet in here? Had Fritz overslept too? He wasn't in his room, and when I called his name, there was no answer. Now, in a panic, I ran into the front room. He was definitely gone, and his shoes were missing from beside the door. My first thought was that he had gone over to the Welcome Building on his own, but I hoped that wasn't the case. We had agreed that it was always safer for the two of us to go there together. Still, I went on a hunt for my shoes, wherever I had pulled them off in the fog of last night. While looking for them, I spotted a note on the kitchen table from Fritz. It only said, "Be back soon. Stay here." There was no word about where he had gone or why or how long he would be gone other than soon, which was useless. Was it something dangerous? Was that why he chose to go alone? To keep me safe? Because if so, then how could I be sure he would be back soon, or even that he would come back at all? With my heart threatening to pound out of my chest, I began pacing the floor. He'd said nothing last night about any errands. Claudia had broken off their relationship, so he wasn't sneaking out to spend time with her. Or at least I thought the relationship was over. If she wanted him back, I knew he'd agree to it in an instant. He talked about her all the time while we were digging, but our conversations about her always ended with him knowing they could never be together. Claudia was fiercely loyal to her father, and her father was no less loyal to the GDR. He wouldn't trust Fritz within a kilometer of her. Finally, I gave up pacing. Not because my anxiety was any better, but because I suspected whoever was on the other end of the hidden microphones might somehow figure out I was pacing and wonder why. We had dishes in the kitchen sink that hadn't been done in days. I washed those up and then swept the floor of all the dirt we had tracked in. Slowly, I became absorbed in that work, because even if I didn't know what was happening with Fritz, at least I was doing something. I went to make my bed, but realized the sheets were filthy from the dirt that came in on my hair and clothes at night. It didn't seem right to make up an unclean bed, but I didn't feel like washing the sheets and hanging them to dry either. A quick glance at Fritz's bed showed his was even worse than mine, and I left them both unmade. It was only then, as I slowed down, that I realized how hungry I was. I'd missed supper last night, and the sandwiches I made for Fritz and me at lunch got thinner every day. Fritz hadn't told me how much money Mama sent in her last letter, but he felt like we ought to save whatever was left for tunneling supplies rather than groceries. The more I went through our empty cupboards, the more I disagreed. We needed food. Mama kept a cookie jar on top of the refrigerator. I never went into it because, as far as I could tell, it had never held cookies or sweets of any kind. But our food supplies were getting low. If she had stashed anything in there, I wanted it. I opened the cookie jar and immediately all my hopes deflated. It was empty. Of food, anyway. An old envelope was at the bottom, though, and I pulled it out, then caught my breath in my throat. It was a letter from Papa. The stamp dated it to September 1961, about the time the wall replaced the barbed wire fence. I pulled out his letter, which began, "To my dear family," but every line after that was blacked out with thick black marker. Every single line. No wonder Papa never wrote to us. There was no point in it. The envelope was addressed with our apartment number, and the return address came from West Berlin. If the return address was current, then that was where Papa lived now. And maybe his letters were blacked out, but if I wrote him, would my words be blacked out too? I couldn't see anything wrong with a daughter writing to her father in the West. No matter who the father was, and no matter what the daughter really wanted, it should be okay. Well, that last part wasn't true. I had to be careful. The letter I wrote to my father was simple. I said nothing more than what absolutely had to be written and weighed each word carefully, just in case the Stasi intercepted it. Papa, I hope all is well with you. We are all fine, though Mama is out of the city to take care of Oma Gertrude's broken leg. Could you please send some money to help us plant a garden? Fritz is looking for work, and we need a little extra. Love, Goethe. I debated whether to mention anything about the tunnel, but couldn't figure out a way to word it that wouldn't tip off the Stasi. There were so many questions I wanted to ask, none of them more important than whether Fritz and I were doing what he wanted by digging that tunnel. But I wasn't foolish enough to write a question like that. Before I could talk myself out of sending the letter, I put a stamp on it and then ran down to the street to drop it in the post office box. That's where I was when Fritz came running up to me with a paper in one hand and a bag in the other. "What are you doing out here?" he asked. "Nothing," I frowned at him. "Where were you? I've been worried." Fritz pulled me near the wall of our building and showed me the paper. "They're called Schrebergärten, allotted spaces for interested families. The state gives permission to garden in certain areas legally. I went to ask if we might use that small piece of land near the Welcome Building to make a garden. This paper is our permit, and in this bag, I even have some small gardening tools and corn seeds." "They just gave them to us?" "The condition is that we don't own the land and we certainly can't live on it. And technically, they'll own everything we grow, though they said we could share in the harvest." "They don't mind that it's so near the wall?" "A lot of farmland comes up to the wall, so they're used to it." Fritz's smile was so wide it nearly spread off his face. "Don't you see? We have a reason to be there now, even their permission. We don't have to sneak on and off the property anymore." My brow furrowed. "We have files, Fritz. Why would they give us permission?" Fritz shrugged. "The Stasi keep the files. Maybe the agriculture office doesn't know about them." He showed me the paper again. "This is good news, Goethe. This could save us." I couldn't share his relief or excitement. This only changed one big problem into a different sort of worry. "Yes, but now we'll have to build a garden instead of digging. When are we going to do that?" Fritz smiled, still pleased with himself. "We'll figure it out, Goethe. Now come on, we've got work to do." Chapter 23. A steady drop will carve the stone. German proverb. As slow as it was to dig out the rock in the tunnel, at least we had been making progress there. The next few days were spent almost entirely in the garden, working hard for no other purpose than as a cover for what we were actually doing, or should have been doing. I didn't mind the idea of gardening, but the weeds were thick and sometimes thorny, and by the third day, it was hard to care about the dirt out here when I really wanted to be down in the tunnel working. After an entire afternoon of pointless, sweaty labor, I didn't think the weeds looked any better than when we first began. When the heat of the day hit us, Fritz and I decided to sneak inside the building to get back to our real work. As before, he went into the tunnel while I removed dirt with the bucket. But the small basement room was already piling high with dirt, and that bothered me. We had a long way to go before we reached the west. What if we ran out of places to store the dirt? Something needed to be done with it. I briefly toyed with the idea of returning to the weeding. At least the weeds didn't require me to think so much. Then I smiled as a wonderful idea came to my mind. If it worked, it would solve both my problems. Rather than dump out the bucket inside the basement, I opened the boarded window and dumped it there. It made a much smaller pile than I expected, so I refilled the bucket from the dirt already in the basement and dumped it outside too. After 5 or 6 loads of dirt, I climbed outside and then used the small hand rake from the state to spread the dirt around. It went down smooth and dark and covered up every single weed beneath it. I didn't need to pull weeds. I could cover them up. Sure, our vegetable seeds wouldn't grow very well once they hit that hard ground a few centimeters down. But I didn't care about that. I didn't plan to be here that long. With renewed energy, I began emptying dirt from the basement. The routine was the same, to dump several loads at once and then spread it out. I did it slowly and tried to make it look as if I was pulling weeds rather than covering them. The watchtower was far enough away that unless the guards looked carefully, there wouldn't be any reason to investigate further. Or at least I hoped not. I was always listening for the approaching sounds of one of their vehicles. After a while, Fritz called up to ask what I was doing, and when I invited him up to see it for himself, he only chuckled and brushed his hand across my head. "Trust you to do so much hard work to get out of other work," he said. "But don't go so fast. If someone is looking for progress, they'll never believe we got all that weeded in a day."